Hi, students. Today we're going to discuss writing a simple book review in 3 steps. It's really important as we get older and we start to read more complicated books, more complicated literature, that we begin to reflect on them, that we begin to think about what we read, and maybe use that reflection to help us pick other books in the future. I like reviewing the books that I've read and using those reviews to help me pick books. So I hope that this process helps you as well. We're going to take a 3-step approach, so it doesn't take too long. I want this to be a quick process. But the big thing is that you reflect, and that in doing so, you also help other students, other people around you, decide whether or not they want to read the book as well. All right, so writing a simple book review in 3 steps. Note that there are a ton of different ways to review books, and people in real life review movies, TV shows, video games. This is a whole lot of people's jobs, and maybe it could be yours too if it's something that you like to do. This is, again, just one quick way that allows you to reflect on what you just read while still allowing others who read your review to decide whether or not they may want to read it too. I would try to review a book as close to when you finish the novel as possible. Don't take a ton of time between when you read the book and when you write it so that your reflections are fresh. So my 3 steps that I have to reviewing a book. Number 1 is to write a brief summary. Big thing is don't spoil the book. Mr. Collins hates spoilers. Stick to the basics of it. Give a preview of the book, but don't go too in depth. Leave the details for the reader. The next is to give your opinion. Well, what's an opinion? It's what you think. I want your honest beliefs about the book. It's okay if we read a book in class and you don't 100% enjoy it. It's okay if you hate the book. Give your honest opinion whenever you go over a review. And then finally, recommend the book for an audience. To recommend something is you want other people to read it. You want to be able to discuss the book with them. Of course, because it's a review and you're being honest, sometimes you don't want to recommend the book for an audience, or maybe you only want specific people if you think specific people should read it. Now let us work through the steps. We're going to do that by going over the book Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. Hatchet's a very popular book, and it has been for over 20 years. And many of you have read the book. In our class poll, over half the class had read it, and the other half probably should try to read it if they find anything we go over interesting. Step 1 will be to summarize. What is a summary, Mr. Collins? Well, a story summary goes over the main points and parts of a book and leaves the details for the reader. Our summary will focus on, I put 2 main things, but we're going to make it 3. First, you're going to look at the characters or the people in the story. Hatchet is a pretty simple one to review because it just has one main character. Conflict is the problem in the story. And lastly, we want to put some kind of note in there about the genre or what type of book it is. This will help other people decide whether or not they might be interested in it. So step 1, summarize. In Hatchet, our main character, his name is Brian. He is 13 years old, so just a little bit older than the 6th graders in my class. And he's a fairly normal boy living a regular life, suddenly put in a dangerous situation. Brian is kind of like a lot of you probably are right now. He's got some difficult family situations going on. He's unsure of what's going to happen to him next. He decides to go visit his father in Canada, who works in an oil field. And on the way, he's going to come upon the major conflict of our story. Now, the conflict, again, is the problem in the story. Conflict drives every story. Just like every book you're going to read is going to have some kind of character in it, as long as it's fiction, there's always going to be some kind of conflict for those characters to work through. When going to visit his father, the pilot of the plane Brian is flying on has a heart attack and dies. After a terrifying plane crash into a lake, Brian finds himself alone in the Canadian wilderness, far from help. In order to survive, Brian will have to rely on his one major tool, a small hatchet, which is just like a small axe. Next up, you want to mention the genre. Again, I said that this part was kind of like a two-step because this is just a very short thing we want to put in the end. I would say that Hatchet is a young adult novel and that it's a survival story in a realistic setting. Of course, we'll go over genre a lot more in class coming up, but for now, try to think of movies you've watched. If it's scary, it might be described as horror. If it's set in space, it might be science fiction. And if it's set in a made up place, it might be called fantasy. Try your best on this, or even look up the genre online if you're not completely sure. So let's look at the summary I wrote. Of course, each of these sections is not going to be perfect, but my point was that it's something that you could write pretty quick. I've read Hatchet semi recently. It's been a little while, so some of my details might be a little bit foggy, but this is what I was able to remember right off. It says Brian is your average 13-year-old, but on a trip to visit his dad, he suddenly comes face to face with a life or death situation when the pilot of his plane suffers a massive heart attack. After a terrifying crash landing, Brian suddenly finds himself alone in the Canadian wilderness, armed only with one major tool, a small hatchet. This survival novel, set in a realistic depiction of absolute wilderness, will have you wondering if Brian can survive an ever-growing list of dangers. Now, again, it's not perfect, but I wrote that in about 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm hoping that you can write your summary in about the same amount of time. You don't want to go over the whole novel. Look at my note at the end. This isn't a true summary. I'm not going over the whole book, just giving enough to give a preview of it. We don't want to spoil it for our reader. Next up, opinion. Step 2 is your opinion. What you thought about it. What did you like about the novel? That would be called the pros sometimes. What did you dislike about the novel? That would be called the cons. Whichever order you prefer is fine, but it might be better to end on the good stuff. If you immediately start off talking about all the great stuff and end your opinion section by talking about the stuff that you disliked, then you might turn the reader away from your book when you actually want them to read it. Of course, it's completely optional. In my opinion part, I ended with the stuff I disliked. You're welcome to do it how you want to, but you want to talk about both the positives and the negatives. So, opinion. Questions to ask yourself to help form an opinion. There's, of course, more questions you could ask yourself, but reflect using things like this. Was the novel confusing? Was it difficult to read or boring? Was it believable? Did you like the author's style of writing? Did it have a satisfying ending? Again, please no spoilers. Did you like the characters and setting? And did you wish the book was longer or shorter? These are really good questions to start off whenever you're forming an opinion, but think about other things that you thought about while you read the novel. If something frustrated you, put it in your opinion section. If you really liked something, feel free to be specific. So, my example for opinion. Overall, I would say that I highly enjoyed Hatchet. Brian feels like a real person, and as you follow his thoughts and fears, you begin to hope that he survives the constant dangers that rise up to confront him. The novel is fast-paced and builds to an epic and terrifying climax. In my opinion, the novel may be a bit too short, and I wanted to know more about what happened after the story ended, which luckily I can thanks to many different sequels. So that's my opinion section. Again, wrote it in 3 or 4 minutes. You want your opinion writing to be quick because you want to be honest, but also make sure that it flows and makes sense. Note how I started off by giving a general opinion about the book. Overall, I would say that I highly enjoyed Hatchet. Perhaps if you didn't like Hatchet a whole lot, you could have started off by saying, overall, Hatchet had enough flaws that I was not a big fan of it. Whatever you put for your opinion section, please be honest, but also fair. Lastly, we have step 3. This is your recommendation part. And this is the part where you recommend the novel to your reader. Of course, since it is a review, you can also choose not to recommend the book or to recommend it only to specific people or a specific audience. Here's the example I wrote for it. I would recommend Hatchet to anyone even remotely interested in survival stories or those who imagine what it would be like to find yourself in a dangerous situation. The novel is a great YA read, though it is important to note that it does have some intense scenes that may be inappropriate for very young children. And for those of you all who's read the book, there's a specific part at the end that's pretty scary. Now, when you're putting your recommendation for it, think about your audience. I put that it's a YA read. It's for young adults. So I would classify that as people who are teenagers or just about to be teenagers, all the way up into full adults. I also put a note at the end that who it might be inappropriate for. If the novel you read has a lot of language or, violence or something like that, put a note about that so that people who are reading a review know that it might be something they want to steer away from. Next up, this is an optional step, and I would still encourage you to do it, but it's not required. Sometimes it's better to write a review without a score and just kind of leave it up in the air. But if you go online and look up reviews for media you enjoy, you'll often see them scored using a number scale. This is done many different ways. For example, someone may review movies and say that it is 4 out of 5 stars, and they'd say that that movie was very good. They'd recommend everybody to go see it. Another person may review a video game and say it's a 9 out of 10. They'd say it's almost perfect. It's like a 90 out of 100. They'd give it an A. Feel free to make your own scale, but the important thing is that you're consistent. To be consistent means that you always try to stick to that scale and you try to have your books match up to that scale very well. I'd put this at the end of your review so that it doesn't spoil what you write. If you put it at the beginning, you might have people just look at the score and then not read what you put. Again, this part's optional, but it may help you keep track of the books you read and better reflect your opinion on it. So just for the sake of seeing the example one more time, this is my review of Hatchet that I wrote. I'm going to go through it again. Pay close attention to the 3 different sections because you'll probably be writing something very similar to this very soon. Brian is your average 13-year-old, but on a trip to visit his dad, he suddenly comes face to face with a life or death situation when the pilot of his plane suffers a massive heart attack. After a terrifying crash landing, Brian suddenly finds himself alone in the Canadian wilderness, armed only with one major tool, a small hatchet. This survival novel, set in a realistic depiction of absolute wilderness, will have you wondering if Brian can survive an ever-growing list of dangers. Overall, I would say that I highly enjoyed Hatchet. Brian feels like a real person, and as you follow his thoughts and fears, you begin to hope that he survives the constant dangers that rise up to confront him. The novel is fast-paced and builds to an epic and terrifying climax. In my opinion, the novel may be a bit too short, and I wanted to know more about what happened after the story ended, which luckily I can thanks to many sequels. I would recommend Hatchet to anyone even remotely interested in survival stories, or those who imagine what it would be like to find yourself in a dangerous situation. The novel is a great YA read, though it is important to note that it does have some intense scenes that may be inappropriate for very young children. Overall, I would hope that my review would make people want to read the book Hatchet. I do want my students to read the book because I personally enjoyed it, and I want to be able to talk with them about it this year. I know that many of you all read it in class in previous years, and if you did so, feel free to recommend the book to your peers who have not. Now, when we go about writing our reviews in class, try to stick to a format kind of like this. I'll allow you a little bit of wiggle room, but we want to keep it short and simple for what we're doing now. You don't want your review to come off as a book, or people probably won't read the whole thing. It should take you probably about 10 to 15 minutes to write, and maybe another 10 to 15 to edit. All right. We are now going to begin after this, probably thinking about what book we're going to review. So start thinking about a book that you've recently finished, that you enjoyed, or maybe even didn't enjoy, that you'd like to write a review for.